Hello, my name is Olivia Slepsky, and I am the co-president of Phi Theta Kappa, Beta Tau Lambda here at Pottstown campus of Montgomery County Community College. We are happy to be presenting you with an information session with our two guest speakers, our Assistant Professor of Speech Communication, Dr. Amanda Gatchett, and our Senior Adjunct Professor in the Political Sciences, Terry Wimmer, regarding the hot-button topic of Confederate statues. Moderating this information session is our Vice President of Service, Gabrielle David-Heiser. Working behind the scenes is our Vice President of Scholarship, Jordan Whittemore, Vice President of Fellowship, Carl Dirk, and our advisor, Kevin Strunk. We want to thank Bill Lottmen and the IT staff here at Montgomery County Community College. Thanks to them, we have the ability to offer this session to further educate our community.
Thanks, Olivia. I'm Gabrielle David-Heiser. I'm the Vice President of Service, and I will be moderating today. This is a topic that is not a new issue, but has become more recently popular. What do you think contributed to it suddenly being such a hot topic? Does it deserve this level of attention? Professor Wimmer?
It's certainly nothing new. These battles have been going on since the 1800s. And they're obviously incredibly complicated. There are moral issues involved. There are political issues that are involved. There are legal issues that are involved. So the issues are certainly nothing new, and they're not going to go away anytime soon either.
I would agree, and I think often because these statues are symbols, they have their place in what we would call public memory. And so public memory is the space where we struggle over what happened in the past and how we understand it in the present and how we preserve what's happening now for the future. And so I agree that this is something that has been going on for a long time, and I don't see it letting up.
What do you feel about the current way this topic is being debated around the country? Do you think that there is a better way to talk about this, Dr. Gatchett?
Well, I think that this topic is always going to be complicated by a lot of factors. And so this topic is complicated by historical issues, it's complicated by political issues, it's complicated by racial issues, it's complicated by cultural issues. And so I think that when you have something like that, then it's sort of hard for people to find common ground. And so I think that the best way to talk about something like this is to sort of recognize where arguments are coming from. Are they coming from a political stance or a cultural stance? And to sort of really investigate what that means and to sort of figure out where there's a common ground in order to move forward.
I think that there's not only been debate, but let's also be honest and say that a lot of the debate was preceded by violence. Violent action in pulling down statues, violent actions by extremist far-right groups in the United States. And one wonders what would have happened to expand our current debate parameters if there had not been violence in Charlottesville, Virginia. There's been an undercurrent of this during the presidency of Barack Obama, and now we have a new president, and now there's violence. And now there's heated debate where during the Obama administration, there's very little violence associated with this issue. So, again, I think we have to be honest that there's violence. It continues to this very day. And that's going to complicate the debate.
Do these monuments primarily represent the Confederacy or the soldiers that fought in the war? Can they be distinguished?
Well, there's more than just the soldiers. There are, in fact, for example, in Statuary Hall in the Capitol, where I used to work as a congressional aide, there are leaders of the Confederacy who have statues just off the rotunda of the Capitol. There are currently bills in both the House and the Senate to remove those statues. It's going to be very interesting to see how members of Congress and their constituents react to this if the bills are passed, which quite frankly is doubtful right now because they're both introduced by Democrats. But if there's a change in the House of Representatives next year, does that mean that we're going to be sending bills to the President of the United States, who quite frankly has been complicit in inflaming the debate on these issues?
I think that it's complicated. I mean, I think that there's probably no doubt that there are some of these monuments that were erected by grieving families after the Civil War to sort of memorialize the people who fought in the war. But I think it's important to recognize that many of these monuments weren't erected until decades after the war and were part of the Jim Crow South and were part of sort of the lost cause narrative, which argues that slavery was not a part of the Civil War. And I think that, whether or not one agrees with the lost cause narrative, I think that erasing those important political and cultural and racial complications is not a fair move. You can't talk about these statues if you don't recognize the complicated past that they came to be in and recognize the complicated situation that we all live in.
These statues play a significant role in the white South's identity. How would removing them affect their culture?
I mean, it's hard for me to say what is white Southern culture because I'm not a white Southerner, and so that's hard for me to make a definitive argument about. But I think that, as with any culture, we have to embrace all of our culture, and so if you're going to latch on to the Confederacy as part of your culture, then you have to recognize the hard parts about that culture. And I think that's one thing in the United States as a whole. In American culture, we have a hard time reconciling with the extreme amount of violence that is at the heart of our culture and is at the heart of our patriotic feelings. We sort of tend to ignore all the violence that has gotten us there. And so I don't know that it will impact the culture. I think that at the end of the day, these statues are monuments. They are symbols, so they're not history. So you're not removing history when you remove statues. The history stays the same. But I think that is up to the community, and I think we also have to recognize that the South is not just white South, and it's not just white Southern identity, that there is a diverse population that lives in the South, and so we have to recognize the community's identity, not just one group.
I think that a couple of things. First, many of these statues in the South are being moved from municipal sites to southern cemeteries that have Confederate dead interred there. But there are currently a number of new monuments to the Civil War dead that are being constructed, and here we get into legal issues, but they are being constructed and funded on private land. And then there's the political aspect of this, and we just saw another example of it Tuesday in Alabama. The exit polls on that race clearly show that white, non-college educated men voted overwhelmingly for the Republican candidate, and for them, there's two issues. Number one, states' rights, and number two, the memories of the Civil War and their defeat. And I think that if any of us deny those realities, we quite frankly have a great deal to learn about what continues to occur in the South to this very day.
If today we consider a statue subject to be relating to racism, does this change the meaning of the statue completely, slightly, or not at all?
That's a tough one. If we consider a statue's subject to be relating to racism, there are, again, many, particularly white men in the South, who believe that this has nothing to do with racism. This, in fact, in their minds, continues to be an issue of states' rights and the fact that the federal government took away their ancestors' slaves and resulted in the destruction of their economies. That's a real tough one to overcome because, quite frankly, I don't think we've had a very honest debate on this. And it's going to take, I think, perhaps a generation for individuals to agree to disagree on this, but at least agree to talk to one another and listen to one another on this, because it's not going to go away.
I agree that it's complicated, and the question makes me think of a current issue where this came into light, and this happened at my alma mater, the University of Texas at Austin, where there were a bunch of Confederate monuments, and sort of in the middle of the night, the president of the university decided to take them down. And this is something that there had been protests about these monuments for at least 10 years and people wanting to take them down. But after Charlottesville, there was this decision to take the statues down. And the rationale, which I think is compelling and interesting, is that it's this idea that these monuments are now, whatever they were before, they've now become symbols of modern white supremacy and neo-Nazism. And the university made the argument that that was not something that represented the university's values. And so I think that in general, we have a duty to sort of recognize history and preserve history, but we also have to recognize that these monuments are a living history in a way, and they are symbols, and we have to recognize sort of what they mean now, because that is something that changes, and that's the nature of symbols. And I think that it's perfectly valid to, when the symbols change and they're not what we're comfortable with anymore, I think that it's a community's right to remove them. And in the UT case, they chose to move the monuments to a museum. So there was a museum that's next to the university, and so they set the monuments up there with some more historical context, and so that was their compromise there.
This is also something that is personal, very personal to me. I'm the proud father of 3 adopted children, and my youngest is part African American and part Hispanic. I gave her a DNA kit for a birthday present a couple years ago, and she discovered that her ancestors came from West Africa, Liberia, and they landed on the island nation of Dominica. And when this whole Charlottesville, Virginia fiasco occurred, she really got upset with the idea of why do we continue to honor men, primarily men, who promoted racism and slavery. And so I've learned a great deal from her in these discussions. But at the same time, I got a sense that only an African-American woman or man can have when they have in fact taken the time to trace their lineage, to trace their heritage, and discover they are in fact descendants of slaves.
Mm-hmm. Just a comment on your point. I think it's interesting too, this notion, it's good to recognize that historically monuments to history have only been white men, and so I think we need to recognize that history happened to all of us and not just these white men. And so there's a lot of conversation about when we remove these monuments that we put in women and people of color and sort of people that can still represent history, but represent history in a way that is more inclusive than it has been.
And the most prominent female is probably Sally Hemings. There's still questions over whether or not she became the wife of Thomas Jefferson, but she certainly had his children. Mm-hmm. And she has been honored in literature, but nothing else.
Yeah.
Do you believe that the removal of the statues from their current placements would be a historical loss?
That depends on the textbooks. There are, in fact, and let's take Texas, for example. Texas has a very unusual state education system where they have one school board for the entire state. And individuals run for public office to be seated on that school board. Here we get into religion as well. There are conservative evangelicals who have run successfully to serve on that school board and who have been directly responsible for changing American history to accommodate their views. And some of those views have to do, quite frankly, with but have racist overtones clearly in the textbooks. And when they approve those textbooks, they are placed, whatever age group, in every single school in the state of Texas. And that is something that has only intensified during the 8-year presidency of Barack Obama and the repeated governorships of Republicans, including their current governor, Greg Abbott.
I mean, that's an interesting point. Although, as an honorary Texan, my family is in Texas. I've lived in Texas a long time. I would not deny that Texas is not the best in terms of public education. I think that they're probably like 48th or 49th, I think, in terms of public education. But it's troubling because that's when education becomes political, and I think that that's a troubling thing. In terms of historical loss, I think I would argue that it doesn't. I think that these statues are monuments, they're symbols, they try to evoke feelings and they try to evoke different things, but I don't know that they always evoke accurate historical thought. And so I think history won't be gone if we remove the statues, but I think that there's a better way to contextualize them. And so many of these statues, part of the problem is that there isn't any sort of historical contextualization, and so often I think this compromise to move them into museums and to put them in a space where we can learn about who these people are and what it means might be a compromise for that.
Well, and each state is different as to how they can, in fact, make the decision to remove or relocate statues. Recent case in Louisiana, where the legal case went all the way to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, who ruled in favor of the governor and the mayor of New Orleans, that they followed applicable state and local law. There's another case, however, and this one I believe was in North Carolina, where a group of individuals just pulled down a statue, and their actions was a criminal violation of the North Carolina Criminal Code. Each state is different in the way in which they approach this, which goes back to an earlier point I made about states' rights. There are no federal laws on the books that would accommodate either the relocation or the destruction of any monuments that were erected in honor of Southern soldiers and political leaders. And that means that, for example, Southern statues of Southern political leaders and soldiers that are in United States national parks in the South, they're going to stay unless there is an act of Congress signed into law by the president to have them removed. But for the rest of the country, it goes back to the state, it goes back to the land in which the statue is constructed on, what the local law is, and what the state law is. So it's far more complicated than what people believe, and quite frankly, that can lead to misunderstandings and, quite frankly, anger.
Excuse me.
Some argue that statues should be placed in a place like a museum. What is a good compromise, in your opinion?
I mean, I think that is a good compromise, but I think that, you make a good point in that it's often hard to say sort of who owns these monuments, and so in terms of when these monuments are on public land, I think that I don't know that a federal mandate to sort of remove all of these statues is really the right thing to do. I think that each community, the community whose taxes pay for the upkeep of these monuments, the community whose members drive by these monuments every day and are, have to think about what these monuments mean. I think really that it should be the community's choice as to what should happen with these statues and whether or not they are taken down or replaced. And so I think really, I think it should be something that happens at a community level. I think that communities should be the ones who make this decision, and I think that the important thing is to recognize the diversity of these communities, and so it's often sort of one group that is really defending these monuments, but I think it's good for all voices to be heard in terms of what they want.
Museums and cemeteries.
Yeah.
It's a good place for them.
Mm-hmm.
What about battlefields?
Again, it depends on who owns the battlefield.
If it's federal.
If it is in fact part of a national park, that's a federal issue. No state or local entity has authority over them. For example, Gettysburg.
Mm-hmm.
It's a national park. You cannot just go in there and rip something out without the approval of the Congress, signed into law by the President of the United States. In the South, there are 3 states that have an overwhelming number of these statues. It's Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, I believe. I think there are over 300 in those states. And again, this goes back to who owns the land. And if the people who own the land say, yeah, come on in, remove it, I don't have any objection to it, well, then that's fine. And there's no legal recourse available to people who might object to that.
Some argue that the Confederate monuments should be completely destroyed. Do you have any argument for or against this course of action?
I have a real serious problem with anyone who believes that the destruction of the statue does not have an impact on our historical understanding of what happened. Gets into issues of free speech, and it also gets into issues, and it's one of the reasons we both love to teach, because we can raise these issues and learn from them, from all kinds of different perspectives. I keep telling my students at the beginning of class and at the end of class, I would not teach unless I learned from them, their experiences. And that's how I feel about this. So I don't see anything wrong rooting them up, putting them in cemeteries, putting them in museums. But the destruction of them destroys part of who we were. And like I said earlier, there are still a significant number of individuals, primarily white, non-college age men in the South, who believe fervently that this is a continuation of the Civil War, this destruction of these monuments.
I tend to agree with you, but I also think that it's interesting in terms of destruction. I think that, as with any symbol, what we do with that symbol has power. And so I think that in keeping these symbols, we're giving power to certain groups that want to keep these symbols. And so I think it's interesting, and I'm not necessarily advocating for this, but I think that protest groups who go in and destroy these monuments are also using that symbol in a very powerful way. And so to sort of destroy something in protest has a lot of interesting complications, and I think that that's a really powerful way to address these statues. And so, but that's just sort of the lover of social movements and in me that thinks that. But I would agree that I think that sort of digging them up and putting them in a place where they can be learned from is perhaps the best course of action.
There's a fascinating debate going on right now in Georgia. What do we do with Stone Mountain, Georgia? The whole cliff face is devoted to Southern Confederate warriors. What do we do? Blow up the mountain? And what's complicating this is that Georgia is now becoming more of a northern state than a southern state, with the immigration of individuals to places like Atlanta, to Macomb County. But this is just fascinating to listen to the debates that occur in the House and the Senate in Georgia about what you do with, you have Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee engraved into a mountain. What do we do with that? What do we do with that? And am I correct in saying that Thomas Jefferson has another monument out in South Dakota as being part of Mount Rushmore? Is Jefferson there? I believe he is. So what do we do about that one? We blow his face off, or Washington? Both slave owners. What do we do then? And what damage do we do to our understanding of our nation's history? I mean, how far does this go? Because if we would do that, for example, to Jefferson, and I don't think it's ever going to happen, but if we did do it, what then do we do with the Jefferson Memorial in Washington? It's a fascinating problem.
What benefits do you think would occur from removing the statues, except the one that's on the side of the mountain? That one's going to be a little bit difficult.
Not to some in the South, particularly some in the Georgia legislature. Some of them have actually said that they would be willing to tie themselves to the side of the mountain to prevent it from preventing it from being destroyed. With all due respect to the Longhorns of the University of Texas, I did my first graduate work at the Fulbright School at the University of Arkansas. So, although admittedly Texas is more south than Arkansas is, with the exception of the southeastern part of the state. We still love Texas.
Well, can't help but love Texas. I mean, I think the benefit to removing these monuments is that we can represent our national thinking now. I think that a benefit to removing monuments can be, as I mentioned before, replacing them with people who better represent who we are as a country and have perhaps better represent who we are as a country always, but sort of shifting this power dynamic that keeps these other bodies, these other types of people from being memorialized. And so I say, you know, put Barbara Jordan up and put up Lucy Stone, put up these other historical figures who have been instrumental in our history in other ways, but we don't memorialize them. And so I think that would be a benefit and an opportunity to embrace the United States as it has always been, as a diverse people.
I worked as a Fulbright scholar in the Congress during Watergate, and Barbara Jordan is one of my heroes. And her death was quite traumatic for me, because I thought that not only as an African-American woman, but as just an American citizen, she had a voice that, quite frankly, we need again desperately. She was so smart and so vocal in her beliefs. She was the type of person that she wouldn't talk a whole heck of a lot unless she had something to say, but look out, when she said it, it had a tremendous impact.
Does a statue that has a dark past serve as a reminder to us that we should learn from the mistakes made?
Who's up now?
You.
Oh, me. Well, I think we can. I think that we can learn from Germany. In Germany, in their nation's constitution, you cannot even speak in language that would remind the German people of Hitler, National Socialism, and the Holocaust. It's a criminal violation. Now, we're not going to go to that extreme in this country because that raises serious First Amendment questions. But we can't forget our history. We simply cannot. We'll repeat it, as the old saying goes, if we don't have an honest discussion about the causes of the United States Civil War. I will tell you what I have told my children. I am extremely worried that when, I think this is going to occur in either the 2030 or 2040 census, Hispanics will be the largest racial group in the United States. And I am extremely worried about that impact of that reality is going to have on American society and American culture, particularly in the South.
I mean, I think that a statue that has a dark past absolutely can serve as a reminder and help us learn from our mistakes, but I don't think that they necessarily do. And I think that the Charlottesville incident is a good example of that, because when these statues sort of become a rallying point for white supremacy and neo-Nazi groups, then we're not sort of learning from our past, we're just sort of re-invoking those values, and I think that that's not something that we as a society necessarily need to tolerate. So,
think I'm going to go off the question sheet for just 1 second.
Uh-oh.
So, do you think that the reactions that we're having to some of these statues and like the events like Charlottesville has more of an impact, a historical impact, rather than the statue itself? Does that make sense?
Well, last night I read the police report, or the independent review group that evaluated the police response to Charlottesville, which was incredibly inept. But, you know, from my political background, let's face it, politicians do things that are politically advantageous for them on a singular basis. What happened in Charlottesville was a horror story. Tragic in the loss of life, the injuries, the response of the president. And I told my students, I said, you know, one of the things that you have to remember about Robert E. Lee was that he committed treason. He was asked by President Lincoln to take over the command of what would become the Union Army. And Lee told the president, no, I'm from Virginia. I'm going to lead the Army of Northern Virginia. That was an act of treason. Robert E. Lee graduated second from the West Point Military Academy, and he was the superintendent of West Point before the Civil War. But he committed treason. And so did every military officer and every Confederate soldier. In fact, you might be interested to know that individuals in the Confederate Army who fought and died to this very day are not considered veterans by the United States government. They're not. Now that says something to us.
Mm-hmm.
At least I hope it would.
I mean, I think it's complicated. I think that the events like Charlottesville, I don't know if they're more historically significant, but I think they do something important in that they bring attention to things that many in the United States have the privilege of ignoring, and myself being one of them, in that there is racism and white supremacy that is still rampant in the United States. Coming from Texas, Texas is still, at least Austin, where my family lives, is still a segregated city. It was a segregated city, and it still is for all intents and purposes. There's a highway that goes through I-35, and there is predominantly black neighborhoods on the east side of that divide, and there's a predominantly Hispanic communities to the south of the river. And so I think that there are historical racial tensions that we like to think have gone away, but they don't. And I think people live those realities every day, and so it sort of brings attention to it in a way that may make folks feel uncomfortable. But again, those of us who may feel uncomfortable might be people who have the privilege of not having to live that reality every day. And I think it's the same as other types of movements, like the Black Lives Matter movement, again, bringing attention to realities that are happening every day that are uncomfortable. And I think that we need to embrace that they're uncomfortable, because it is uncomfortable, but we need to do something about it and not just sort of pretend that we, as a society, has moved forward perhaps more than we have.
Last day of class in the fall semester, I announced to the class what I had just heard that morning, that the police officer who shot an African-American man in the back and killed him had been convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years in jail. And my African-American students, our African-American students, almost in one voice, yelled out, Finally. That said something to me as a white man, and something that I'm obviously still thinking about.
If we do not remove the statues, does this mean that our society is becoming stagnant and no longer working to better ourselves?
I don't think necessarily that would be the case, but I think that, I mean, whether or not we remove these statues, I think, again, it has to be sort of a decision made by the community, but I think that what we can do is make a point of contextualizing these monuments and sort of talking about what they mean and recognizing the violent history that these monuments represent. And so I think that, you know, in order to work to better ourselves, we have to, again, we need to sort of pay attention to the past and remember the past, but we don't always have to revere it. We don't have to protect it in a way that makes us feel comfortable. I think that we need to interrogate the past if you're ever going to sort of learn from it.
I agree.
Okay, next question. Do you believe we have mostly overcome the negative history behind the statues?
No, not even close. For all the things I spoke about earlier, and again, you know, we got a very clear batch of evidence when we looked at the exit polling from Tuesday's vote in Alabama. I don't want to harp on this, but it is still a reality in the Deep South. We'll get another test of this in Mississippi when there are statewide elections, as well as in some parts of Louisiana, and like I said, the southeastern part of Arkansas, also Tennessee and Kentucky. That type of white conduct is still prevalent in the South. It's not going to go away. There is a religious perpetuation of those attitudes in some religious denominations in the South, predominantly in the South, just like there is also a very strong African-American religious tradition in the South that was also expressed very clearly in what happened in Alabama on Tuesday. And I hope we can take some promise in that.
I mean, especially since Alabama is historically the state that has the voter suppression, and so the fact that
Yep.
that was very historical. I don't think we've overcome negative history, and I think that it boils down to power, and it boils down to whose interests are being served by these monuments, by the laws that we make, by the people that we police or don't police. And so I think that that's something that is always going to be in play, and I think we have to recognize the power dynamics behind these things if we're ever going to really talk about them in a productive way, because power often hides behind things like culture, and so we have to recognize that.
Okay. Do you think removing these statues would also remove our potential to learn from our history and grow a society? I think I already know that you're going to say yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. I have a speech professor over here, and I shouldn't respond by saying yeah.
That's okay. And I would say no. I don't think that we necessarily lose that potential to learn from our history just by losing these monuments, because in my understanding, these monuments are symbols, and I think that we can find other symbols that can teach us just as much from our history. And I think that by being there, just simply by being there, they're not often living up to that potential. And so if they're not contextualized in the first place, then I'm not sure that we lose that historical context.
If the Confederate statues were all removed, would we see progress for social change, or would it further divide between those for and against removal?
Well, again, we have to be respectful of the process. As I said earlier, it depends on where these statues are located. If they are located on public land, the federal courts have already ruled that if you follow the process, public hearing notices, and you go do the right thing as outlined in the statute, then sure. Baltimore, the city of Baltimore removed 4 Confederate statues. They did it very quietly in the middle of the night. They had the legal authority to do it. And quite frankly, you know, I read the online version of the Baltimore Sun, and it's fine. But then there are also other places where, like I said earlier, I believe it was in North Carolina, a group of individuals got together and hauled down a statue, and they violated a criminal statute. So I think we have to be extremely careful of the process. At the same time, it's exciting to see that there are still leaders from the civil rights movement in the 60s who are still extremely active in taking a positive role in the dialogue on what these monuments mean to the history of our country. The opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum this past week. But I have to wonder what was served by a number of civil rights leaders who chose not to show up because the president dedicated the museum. While at the same time, we have the wonderful Museum of African American History in DC. So we can learn from those experiences, and protest is a vital reality of our Constitution, and it must continue to be tested. It must continue to be an organic life form to the blood of our country. When we lose that, we lose our soul.
I agree.
Okay. Do you think educating people about the negative and positive aspects of the statues would help them understand the perspectives of other people and be more inclined to compromise?
I think so. I think that, I mean, that's the key to persuasion, if we're going to talk about it from a scholarly stance for just a moment, is if you ever want to persuade anybody, you have to find common ground. And so if I want you to understand something from my perspective, then I've got to figure out how you understand things from your perspective. Having said that, though, I think that there are some really troubling, complicated things that I don't know that we want to compromise about. So I don't necessarily think that we should compromise about slavery. I think having enslaved people is bad historically. I think that we need to recognize that and move forward from that. But in doing that, not erase that experience. And I think that sometimes this idea of culture, when it gets tied into Southern culture, we sort of erase this notion of the fact that millions of people were enslaved, and that's troubling.
I have a reputation with my students that I'm proud of. I know when to push buttons and to be a devil's advocate in the interest of education, and nothing more than that. And that goes back to something I said earlier about learning from my students. It's imperative at all levels of education that we passionately share our experiences from our perspective and also listen. As a speech professor, one of the things that drives me a little crazy is when it becomes clear to me that we're not listening to each other. Because when we stop that, we're in serious trouble. Serious trouble. How can we possibly learn if we don't agree to learn from our dialogue?
If one side is unwilling to engage in civil discussions, is the other side justified in engaging in the same tactics? What happens if they both refuse to communicate?
What tactics? Let's put a
You're
student on
making
the
me
spot.
read over the question.
No, I just pushed a button. What tactics are you talking about?
You know, I see a lot of the time online, because that is the safer place for people to go. They're not being civil. The tactics are kind of bullying. And I don't know if you would just describe it as ganging up on people, but they're very personalized. And I think instead of, if I had to reword this question, it would be more, I think, insulting people. Like, if I stoop to your level, does that make it okay for me to stoop? For me to, I can't reword this. It's basic parenting 101. When your younger sibling hits you and you're about to hit them back and your mom goes, don't do it, don't stoop to their level. Does that make more sense?
Sure.
You pressed my button. So, do you think that's okay?
I'd still have a question about tactics. Being also a theologian, I embrace Martin Luther King Jr. and all forms of nonviolent protest. We gain nothing from violence, even in war. We gain very little. And King wrote in his Nobel Prize winning letter from a Birmingham jail that if we believe that a law is unjust, then we first must make the decision not to follow it, and then secondly, to protest against it, even if it means putting our lives in jeopardy. That is, quite frankly, the only tactic against unjust laws that I embrace.
And it's interesting that you went there, because I was thinking about nonviolent protests as well. And I think that what's important to realize is that there's a power dynamic in the sides. And so nonviolent protest only works when the state is being violent. And so the nonviolent protests of the civil rights movement only worked because they highlighted the unjust violence of the police and of the state. And so I think that, often that and sort of the incivility of the state and the power of the state to do that is often hidden in things like our laws and policing. And so I think it's important as citizens that we be able to challenge those things. But I agree, I think that nonviolence is often a good way to do that, to sort of point out those.
The 60s civil rights struggle really got its grasp on the North as a result of television.
Mm-hmm.
The horror of what happened at the Pettus Bridge in Selma, when citizens in the North, including myself, I was 13 years old at the time when this happened, and seeing police dogs biting into other Americans and just having the living beaten out of them, firebombing buses containing fellow American citizens who were working to overcome injustice. Now let me flash forward to today. There is a revolution occurring in our online medias, and particularly the introduction of, shall we say, fake media, and not the kind that our president talks about. The introduction of fake ads, fake news stories, in order to divide us. And one of the groups that was targeted in the 2016 election was the Black Lives Matter movement. We have to be vigilant. And we also have to have the courage to stand up and say, no, that's not true. That's not right. It's false. And then to offer an alternative. We can talk all we want, but if we are unwilling to take that next step, then I just simply ask, what are we doing? What are we doing?
So final question, pre-question. If we remove one statue, do we remove them all? Should we be working to replace anything, including the Washington Monument, and renaming Washington, D.C., to make sure that no slaveholders are honored in public? What about monuments that represent slavery outside of the United States, including the pyramids?
We'll take that one first.
Sure. So in terms of the things that are happening outside of the United States, I'm going to just cleave that off and leave that for someone else, right? So I think we have enough complications within the United States. And what I think, this is sort of going along with a statement that was made by the National Trust for Historical Preservation after the Charlottesville incident. They sort of came out with this statement, and I agree, is this notion that sort of as communities, we have to work together to find that balance. And we have to do it in a way that's transparent so that we understand what's going on, that's inclusive, and I think that embraces the complexity of the fact that there are many sides that need to be heard or that have a stake in history. And so I think that if we do that, and if we leave it to the community level, and again, if we aren't divided, and if we find that common ground, then I think that that's probably the most productive way to deal with these monuments.
The White House was built by slaves. Completely. But I can't find a really good explanation for why it was called the White House, other than that was the kind of paint that they had available to them. What do we do with that reality? The Capitol, also built by slaves. And I mentioned earlier about the Jefferson Memorial. Each year, I go down to the Arlington National Cemetery. And for the last 10 years, I've gone to Section 60, where our Iraqi and Afghan war victims are buried. But in the process of that journey, walking all around the cemetery, I always end up near the Lee Mansion that overlooks not just Arlington, but Washington, D.C. Abraham Lincoln made the decision to bury Union Civil War dead in the front and backyards of the Lee Mansion. That really tells me a great deal about the motivation of our president. And that cemetery is filled with Confederate war dead.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do with them? Do we dig them up and reinter them in Southern cemeteries? How far do we go with this? It's a dialogue that we have to have. I suspect I'm going to be dead and gone, and we still won't have this resolved because it is deeply inbred in particularly our Southern sisters and brothers. Their families still talk about this all the time. In just kind of preparing for this, I didn't know this. I found out that the last Confederate soldier died in 1959 when I was 8 years old. Now, their families, that family, those generations, I'll guarantee you still talk about that. And I wonder, just a question, I wonder if you living in Texas and my second home in Arkansas, what influence has that had on your thinking about this?
I mean, that's a good question. I did my graduate work in Texas, and I actually did my undergraduate work at Vanderbilt in Nashville, Tennessee. And when I first went to Tennessee, I remember I went to some historical site, I can't even remember that, and the woman giving the tour was still talking about, she was saying, when we lost the war, was how she framed it, and it was like, it was very striking to me because I was like, what are you talking about? Like, it's because I didn't learn about the Civil War. To me, was a very far away thing that happened historically, but I think, in these southern states, it's something that isn't as far away, and it is very much a part of that culture. But I also think, having lived in Tennessee and having lived in Texas, has perhaps opened my eyes in a lot of ways to racial tensions, because I think that and I think this happens everywhere, but I think in those particular places, race is still very much something that is struggled over. Particularly, more so Texas is where sort of I have experienced it, and I think in that way it has influenced me for the better, because you sort of can see what's happening. And I think, kind of to go back to your idea, so the White House was built by slaves. Do we tear it down? I say no, but I think that we need to recognize that and be more open with it and talk about it, because that's just as much a part of history as the building.
2 comments. Number one, we haven't talked about reparations.
No.
This is something that absolutely destroyed Jesse Jackson's attempt to become president of the United States back in 1988. And secondly, I was born and raised about 30 minutes from here in Upper Bucks County, a little farm community. So when I left Penn State and drove to Arkansas, never forget, it was 4:30 in the morning, I'm driving on the interstate, and all of a sudden my muffler falls off on my white Rambler station wagon. I was in the town of Cuba, Missouri. I mean, just a little dot on a map. So I pulled off the interstate and drove over to the first gas station I could find. And I had to go to the bathroom. Gas station wasn't open. So I walk around the side thinking there was a bathroom there, and I was right. There was, with a sign, white only. And this white kid from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, who never confronted the question of race before in his life, suddenly was confronted with it.
Well, that completes our information session.
Thank you for doing this.
Yes, thanks for having us.
Really appreciate both of you guys being here. Thank you both, and thanks to our supports here at Monco. We hope this has provided valuable information to our viewers as we embark on completing our Honors in Action project with our fellow Phi Theta Kappa, Beta Tau Lambda members. Thank you.